Chapter 7 of The Englishwoman in America by Isabella Bird into the public domain. Chapter 7 The important towns in the United States bear designations of a more poetical nature than might be expected from so commercial a people. New York is the Empire City, Philadelphia the City of Brotherly Love, Cleveland the Forest City, Chicago the Prairie City, and Cincinnati the Queen City of the West. These names are no less appropriate than poetical, and none more so than that applied to Cincinnati. The view from any of the terraced heights round the town is magnificent. I saw it first bathed in the mellow light of a declining sun. Hill beyond hill, clothed with the rich verdure of an almost tropical clime, slopes of vineyards just ready for the winepress, magnolias with their fragrant blossoms, and that queen of trees, the beautiful ailanthus, the tree of heaven, as it is called, and everywhere foliage so luxuriant that it looked as if autumn and decay could never come. And in a hollow near us lay the huge city, so full of life, its busy hum rising to the height where I stood, and 200 feet below, the beautiful cemetery, where its dead await the morning of the resurrection. Yet, while contrasting the trees and atmosphere here with the comparatively stunted, puny foliage of England, and the chilly skies of a northern clime, I thought with Cowper respecting my own dear but far distant land, "England, with all thy faults I love thee still, my country! I would not yet exchange thy sullen skies, and fields without a flower, for warmer France, with all her vines, nor for Ausonia's groves, her golden fruitage, or her myrtle bowers." The change in the climate was great from that in which I had shivered a week before, with the thermometer at 33° in the sun, yet I did not find it oppressive here at 105° in the shade, owing to the excessive dryness of the air. The sallow complexions of the New Englanders were also exchanged for the fat, ruddy faces of the people of Ohio, the Buckeyes, as their neighbours designate them. The town of Cincinnati, situated on the navigable stream of the Ohio, 1,600 miles from the sea, is one of the most remarkable monuments of the progress of the West. A second Glasgow in appearance, the houses built substantially of red brick, 6 stories high, huge sign-boards outside each floor denoting the occupation of its owner or lessee, heavily laden drays rumbling along the streets, quays at which steamboats of fairy architecture are ever lying, massive warehouses and rich stores, the sidewalks a perfect throng of foot-passengers, the roadways crowded with light carriages, horsemen with palmetto hats and high-peaked saddles galloping about on the magnificent horses of Kentucky, an air of life, wealth, hustle, and progress, are some of the characteristics of a city which stands upon ground where 60 years ago an unarmed white man would have been tomahawked as he stood. The human aspect is also curious. Palmetto hats, light blouses, and white trousers form the prevailing costume, even of the clergy, while Germans smoke chibouks and luxuriate in their shirt-sleeves. Southerners, with the enervated look arising from residence in a hot climate, lounge about the streets. Dark-browed Mexican, in sombreras and high-slashed boots, dash about on small, active horses with Mamluk bits. Rovers and adventurers from California and the far West, with massive rings in their ears, swagger about in a manner which shows their country and calling, and females, richly dressed, are seen driving and walking about, from the fair-complexioned European to the negress or mulatto. The windows of the stores are arranged with articles of gaudy attire and heavy jewellery, suited to the barbaric taste of many of their customers; but inside I was surprised to find the richest and most elegant manufactures of Paris and London. A bookseller's store, an aggregate of 2 or 3 of our largest, indicated that the culture of the mind was not neglected. The number of carriages, invariably drawn by 2 horses, astonished me. They were the red horses of Kentucky and the jet black of Ohio, splendid, proud-looking animals, looking as if they could never tire or die. Except the trotting baskets and light wagons, principally driven by swells or young Americans, all the vehicles were covered, to preserve their inmates from the intense heat of the sun. In the evening hundreds, if not thousands, of carriages are to be seen in the cemetery and along the roads, some of the German ladies driving in low dresses and short sleeves. As everybody who has 100 yards to go drives or rides, rings are fastened to all sidewalks in the town to tether the horses to. Many of the streets are planted with the ailanthus tree, and frequently one comes upon churches of tasteful architecture, with fretted spires pointing to heaven. I went upon the Ohio, lessened by long drought into a narrow stream, in a most commodious high-pressure steamboat, and deemed myself happy in returning uninjured, for beautiful and fairy-like as these vessels are, between their own explosive qualities and the snags and sawyers of the rivers, their average existence is only 5 years. Cincinnati in 1800 was a wooden village of 750 inhabitants. It is now a substantially built brick town, containing 200,000 people, and thousands of fresh settlers are added every year. There are nearly 50,000 Germans, and I believe 40,000 Irish, who distinctly keep up their national characteristics. The Germans almost monopolize the handicraft trades, where they find a fruitful field for their genius and industry. The Irish are here, as everywhere, hewers of wood and drawers of water; they can do nothing but dig, and seldom rise in the social scale. The Germans, as at home, are a thinking, sceptical, theorizing people; in politics, socialists; in religion, atheists. The Irish are still the willing and ignorant tools of an ambitious and despotic priesthood. And in a land where no man is called to account for his principles, unless they proceed to physical development, these errors grow and luxuriate. The Germans, in that part of the town almost devoted to themselves, have succeeded in practically abolishing the Sabbath, as they utterly ignore that divine institution even as a day of rest, keeping their stores open the whole day. The creeds which they profess are Socialism and Universalism, and at stated periods they assemble to hear political harangues, and address invocations to universal deity. Skilled, educated, and intellectual, they are daily increasing in numbers, wealth, and political importance, and constitute an influence of which the Americans themselves are afraid. The Irish are a turbulent class, forever appealing to physical force, influencing the elections, and carrying out their clan feuds and faction fights. The Germans, finding it a land like their own, of corn and vineyards, have named the streets in their locality in Cincinnati after their old towns in the Old World, to which in idea one is frequently carried back. On Sunday, after passing through this continental portion of the town, I found all was order and decorum in the strictly American part, where the whole population seemed to attend worship of one form or another. The church which I attended was the most beautiful place of worship I ever saw. It had neither the hallowed but comfortless antiquity of our village churches, nor the glare and crush of our urban temples. It was of light Norman architecture, and lighted by windows of rich stained glass. The pews were wide, the backs low, and the doors and mouldings were of polished oak. The cushions and linings were of crimson damask, and light fans for real use were hung in each pew. The pulpit and reading desk, both of carved oak and of a tulip shape, were placed in front of the communion rails, on a spacious platform ascended by 3 steps. This, the steps, and the aisles of the church were carpeted with beautiful Kidderminster carpeting. The singing and chanting were of a very superior description, being managed, as also a very fine-toned organ, by the young ladies and gentlemen of the congregation. The ladies were more richly dressed and in brighter colours than the English, and many of them in their features and complexions bore evident traces of African and Spanish blood. The gentlemen universally wore the moustache and beard, and generally blue or green frock-coats, the collars turned over with velvet. The responses were repeated without the assistance of a clerk, and the whole service was conducted with decorum and effect. The same favourable description may apply generally to the churches of different denominations in the United States. Coldness and discomfort are not considered as incentives to devotion, and the houses of worship are ever crowded with regular and decorous worshippers. Cincinnati is the outpost of manufacturing civilization, though large, important, but at present unfinished cities are rapidly springing up several hundred miles farther to the west. It has regular freight steamers to New Orleans, St. Louis, and other places on the Missouri and Mississippi, to Wheeling and Pittsburgh, and thence by railway to the great Atlantic cities, Philadelphia and Baltimore, while it is connected with the Canadian lakes by railway and canal to Cleveland. till I thoroughly understood that Cincinnati is the centre of a circle embracing the populous towns of the South, and the increasing populations of the lake countries in the Western Territories, with their ever-growing demand for the fruits of manufacturing industry, I could not understand the utility of the vast establishments for the production of household goods which arrest the attention of the visitor to the Queen City. There is a furniture establishment in Baker Street, London, which employs perhaps 80 hands, and we are rather inclined to boast of it, but we must keep silence when we hear of a factory as large as a Manchester cotton mill, 5 stories high, where 260 hands are constantly employed in making chairs, tables, and bedsteads. At the factory of Mitchell and Ramelsburg common chairs were the principal manufacture, and are turned out at the rate of 2500 a week, worth from between £1 1s. to £5 1s. a dozen. Rocking chairs, which are only made in perfection in the States, are fabricated here; also chests of drawers, of which 2000 are made annually. Baby rocking cribs, in which the brains of the youth of America are early habituated to perpetual restlessness, are manufactured here in surprising quantities. The workmen at this factory, most of whom are native Americans and Germans, the English and Scotch being rejected on account of their intemperance, earn from $12 to $14 a week. At another factory 1000 bedsteads, worth from £1 1s. to £5 1s. each, are completed every week. There are vast boot and shoe factories, which would have shod our whole Crimean army in a week, at one of which the owner pays $60,000, or £12,000 in wages annually. It consumes 5000 pounds weight of boot nails per annum. The manufactories of locks and guns, tools and carriages, with countless other appliances of civilized life, are on a similarly large scale. Their products are to be found among the sugar plantations of the South, the diggers of California, the settlers in Oregon, in the infant cities of the far West, the tent of the hunter, and the shanty of the immigrant; in one word, wherever demand and supply can be placed in conjunction. And while the demand is ever increasing as the tide of immigration rolls westward, so the inventive brains of the Americans are ever discovering some mechanical means of abridging manual labour, which seldom or ever meets the demand. The saws, axes, and indeed all cutting tools made at respectable establishments in the States, are said to be superior to ours. On going into a hardware store at Hamilton in Upper Canada, I saw some English spades and axes, and I suppose my face expressed some of the admiration which my British pride led me to feel, for the owner, taking up some spades and cutting tools of Cincinnati manufacture, said, "We can only sell these; the others are bad workmanship, and won't stand 2 days' hard work." Articles of English manufacture are not seen in considerable quantities in the wholesale stores, and even the import of foreign wines has been considerably diminished by the increasingly successful culture of the grape in Ohio, 130,000 gallons of wine having been produced in the course of the year. Wines resembling hock, claret, and champagne are made, and good judges speak very highly of them. Cincinnati is famous for its public libraries and reading rooms. The Young Men's Mercantile Library Association has a very handsome suite of rooms opened as libraries and reading rooms, the number of books amounting to 16,000; these, with upwards of 100 newspapers, being well selected by a managing committee, none of our English works of good repute being awanting. The facility with which English books are reprinted in America, and the immense circulation which they attain in consequence of their cheapness, greatly increases the responsibility which rests upon our authors as to the direction which they give, whether for good or evil, to the intelligent and inquiring minds of the youth of America, minds ceaselessly occupied, both in religion and politics, on investigation and inquiry, in overturning old systems before they have devised new ones. I believe that the most important religious denominations in Cincinnati are the Episcopalian, the Baptist, and the Wesleyan. The first is under the superintendence of the learned and pious Bishop M'Ilvaine, whose apostolic and untiring labours have greatly advanced the cause of religion in the state of Ohio. There is a remarkable absence of sectarian spirit, and the ministers of all orthodox denominations act in harmonious combination for the general good. But after describing the beauty of her streets, her astonishing progress, and the splendour of her shops, I must not close this chapter without stating that the Queen City bears the less elegant name of Porkopolis; that swine, lean, gaunt, and vicious looking, riot through her streets; and that, on coming out of the most splendid stores, one stumbles over these disgusting intruders. Cincinnati is the city of pigs. As there is a railway system and a hotel system, so there is also a pig system, by which this place is marked out from any other. Huge quantities of these useful animals are reared after harvest in the cornfields of Ohio, and on the beech mast and acorns of its gigantic forests. At a particular time of year they arrive by thousands, brought in droves and steamers to the number of 500,000 to meet their doom, when it is said that the Ohio runs red with blood. There are huge slaughter-houses behind the town, something on the plan of the abattoirs of Paris, large wooden buildings, with numerous pens, from whence the pigs march in single file along a narrow passage, to an apartment where each, on his entrance, receives a blow with a hammer, which deprives him of consciousness, and in a short time, by means of numerous hands and a well-managed cauldron system, he is cut up and ready for pickling. The day on which a pig is killed in England constitutes an era in the family history of the year, and squeals of a terrific description announce the event to the neighbourhood. There is not time or opportunity for such a process at Porkopolis, and the first notification which the inhabitants receive of the massacre is the 1,000 barrels of pork on the quays, ready to be conveyed to the Atlantic cities, for exportation to the European markets. At one establishment 12,000 pigs are killed, pickled, and packed every fall, and in the whole neighbourhood, as I have heard in the cars, the hog crop is as much the subject of discussion and speculation as the cotton crop of Alabama, the hop picking of Kent, or the harvest in England. Kentucky, the land, by reputation, of red horses, bowie knives, and gouging, is only separated from Ohio by the river Ohio, and on a day when the thermometer stood at 103 degrees in the shade, I went to the town of Covington. Marked, wide, and almost inestimable is the difference between the free state of Ohio and the slave state of Kentucky. They have the same soil, the same climate, and precisely the same natural advantages, yet the total absence of progress, if not the appearance of retrogression and decay, the loungers in the streets, and the peculiar appearance of the slaves, afford a contrast to the bustle on the opposite side of the river, which would strike the most unobservant. I was creditably informed that property of the same real value was worth $300 in Kentucky and $3,000 in Ohio. Free immigrants and workmen will not settle in Kentucky, where they would be brought into contact with compulsory slave labor. Thus the development of industry is retarded, and the difference will become more apparent every year, till possibly some great changes will be forced upon the legislature. Few English people will forget the impression made upon them by the first sight of a slave, a being created in the image of God, yet the bona fide property of his fellow man. The first I saw was an African female, the slave of a lady from Florida, with a complexion black as the law which held her in captivity. The subject of slavery is one which has lately been brought so prominently before the British people by Mrs. Beecher Stowe, that I should be pardoned for making a few remarks upon it. Powerfully written as the book is, and as much as I admire the benevolent intentions of the writer, I am told that the effect of the volume has been prejudicial, and this assertion is borne out by persons well acquainted with the subject in the Free States. A gentleman very eminent in his country, as having devoted himself from his youth to the cause of abolition, as a steadfast pursuer of one grand principle, together with other persons, say that Uncle Tom's Cabin had thrown the cause back for many years. The excitement on the subject still continues in England, though it found a safety valve in the Stafford House Manifesto, and the received impression, which no force of fact can alter, is that slave owners are divided into but two classes: brutalized, depraved Legrees, or enthusiastic, visionary St. Clairs, the former, of course, predominating. Slavery, though under modifications which rendered it a little more than the apprenticeship of our day, was permitted under the Mosaic dispensation, but it is contrary to the whole tenor of Christianity, and a system which lowers man as an intellectual and responsible being is no less morally than politically wrong. That it is a political mistake is plainly evidenced by the retarded development and apparent decay of the Southern States, as compared with the ceaseless material progress of the North and West. It cannot be doubted that in Alabama, Florida, and Louisiana, Legrees are to be found, for cruelty is inherent in base natures. We have Legrees in our factories and coal pits, but in England their most terrible excesses are restrained by the strong arm of law, which, when appealed to, extends its protection to the feeblest and most helpless. What then must such men become in the isolated cotton or sugar plantations of the South, distant from the restraints which public opinion exercises, and where the evidence of a slave is inadmissible in a court of justice? The full extent of the cruelties practised will never be known, until revealed at the solemn tribunal of the last day. But we dare not hope that such men are rare, though circumstances of self-interest combine to form a class of slave owners of a higher grade. These are men who look upon their slaves as we do upon our cows and horses, as mere animal property, of greater or less value according to the care which is taken of them. The slaves of those persons are well clothed, lodged, and fed. They are not overworked, and dancing, singing, and other amusements, which increase health and cheerfulness, are actively promoted. But the system is one which has for its object the transformation of reason into instinct, the lowering of a rational being into a machine scarcely more intelligent in appearance than some of our own ingeniously contrived steam engines. Religious teaching is withheld, and the instruction of a slave in it punished as a crime, lest he should learn that freedom is his birthright. A third and very large class of slave owners is to be found, who, having inherited their property in slaves, want the means of judiciously emancipating them. The negroes are not in a condition to receive freedom in the reckless way in which some abolitionists propose to bestow it upon them. They must be prepared for it by instruction in the precepts of religion, by education, and by the reception of those principles of self-reliance, without which they have not the moral perception requisite to enable them to appreciate the blessings of freedom. And this very ignorance and obtuseness is one of the most telling arguments against the system which produces it. The want of this previous preparation has been frequently shown, particularly in Kentucky, where whole bodies of emancipated slaves, after a few days' experience of their new condition, have entreated for a return to servitude. These slave owners, of whom I now speak, deeply deplore the circumstances under which they are placed, and, while wanting the spirit of self-sacrifice and the moral courage which would lead them, by manumitting their slaves, to enter into a novel competition with slave labour on other estates, to do their best to ameliorate the condition in which the Africans are placed, encouraged them, by the sale of little articles of their own manufacture, to purchase their freedom, which is granted at a very reduced rate. I had opportunities of conversing with several of these freed negroes, and they all expressed attachment to their late owners, and spoke of the mildness with which they were treated, saying that the great threat made use of was to send them down south. The slaves in the northern slave states are a thoughtless, happy set, spending their evenings in dancing or singing to the banjo, and "Oh, carry me back to old Virginny," or "Susanna, don't you cry for me," may be heard on summer evenings rising from the maize and tobacco grounds of Kentucky. Yet whether naturally humane instincts may lead to merciful treatment of the slave, or the same result be accomplished by the rigorous censorship of public opinion in the border states, apart from the abstract question of slavery, that system is greatly to be reprobated which gives power without responsibility, and permits the temporal, yes, the eternal well-being of another to depend upon the will and caprice of a man, when the victim of his injustice is deprived of the power of an appeal to an earthly tribunal. Instances of severe treatment on one side, and of kindness on the other, cannot fairly be brought as arguments for or against the system. It must be justified or condemned by the undeviating law of moral right as laid down in divine revelation. Slavery existed in 1850 in 15 out of 31 states, the number of slaves being 3,204,345, connected by sympathy and blood with 433,643 colored persons nominally free, but who occupy a social position of the lowest grade. It is probable that this number will increase, as it has hitherto done, in a geometrical ratio, which will give 6,000,000 in 1875, of a people dangerous from numbers merely, but doubly, trebly so in their consciousness of oppression, and in the passions which may incite them to a terrible revenge. America boasts of freedom, and of such a progress as the world has never seen before, but while the tide of the Anglo-Saxon race rolls across her continent, and while we contemplate with pleasure a vast nation governed by free institutions, and professing a pure faith, a hand, faintly seen at present, but destined ere long to force itself upon the attention of all, points to the empires of a bygone civilization, and shows that they had their periods in which to rise, flourish, and decay, and that slavery was the main cause of that decay. The exasperating reproaches addressed to the Americans, in ignorance of the real difficulties of dealing with the case, have done much harm in inciting that popular clamour which hurries on reckless legislation. The problem is one which occupies the attention of thinking and Christian men on both sides of the Atlantic, but still remains a gigantic evil for philanthropists to mourn over and for politicians to correct. An unexceptional censure ought not to be pronounced without a more complete knowledge of the subject than can be gained from novels and newspapers. Still less ought this censure to extend to America as a whole, for the people of the Northern States are more ardent abolitionists than ourselves, more consistent, in fact, for they have no white slaves, no oppressed factory children, the cry of whose wrongs ascends daily into the ears of an avenging judge. Still, blame must attach to them, for the way in which they place the coloured people in an inferior social position, a rigid system of exclusiveness shutting them out from the usual places of amusement and education. It must not be forgotten that England bequeathed this system to her colonies, though she has nobly blotted it out from those which still own her sway, that it is encouraged by the cotton lords of Preston and Manchester, and that the great measure of negro emancipation was carried, not by the violent declamation and ignorant railings of men who sought popularity by exciting the passions of the multitude, but by the persevering exertions and practical Christian philanthropy of Mr. Wilberforce and his coadjutors. It is naturally to be expected that a person writing a book on America would offer some remarks upon this subject, and raise a voice, however feeble, against so gigantic an evil. The conclusions which I have stated in the foregoing pages are derived from a careful comparison and study of facts which I have learned from eminent speakers and writers both in favour of and against the slave system. Chapter 8. Read by Sibella Denton. For more information, please visit LibriVox.org. Of the Englishwoman in America by Isabella Lucy Bird. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 8. A bright September sun glittered upon the spires of Cincinatti as I reluctantly bade it adieu, and set out in the early morning by the cars to join my travelling companions, meaning to make as long a detour as possible, or, as a down east lady might say, to make a pretty considerable circumlocution. Fortunately I had met with some friends, well acquainted with the country, who offered to take me round a much larger circle than I had contemplated, and with a feeling of excitement, such as I had not before experienced, we started for the Mississippi and the western prairies en route to Detroit. Bishop Milvain, anxious that a very valued friend of his in England should possess something from Ohio, had cut down a small sapling, which, when divested of its branches and otherwise trimmed, made a very formidable-looking bludgeon or cudgel, nearly 4 feet long. This being too lengthy for my trunks was tied to my umbrella, and on this day in the cars excited no little curiosity, several persons eyeing it, then me, as if wondering in what relation we stood to each other. Finally they took it up, minutely examining it, and tapping it to see whether anything were therein concealed. It caused me much amusement, and from its size some annoyance, till at length, wishing to leave it in my room at a Toronto hotel while I went for a visit of a few days, the waiter brought it down to the door, asking me if I wished to take the cudgel. After this I had it shortened, and it travelled in my trunk to New York, where it was given to a carver to be fashioned into a walking-stick, and unless the tradesman played a Yankee trick, and substituted another, it is now, after surviving many dangers by sea and land, in the possession of the gentleman for whom it was intended. Some amusing remarks were made upon England by some of the Buckeyes, as the inhabitants of Ohio are called. On trying to persuade a lady to go with me to St. Louis, I observed that it was only 500 miles. 500 miles! she replied. Why, you'd tumble off your paltry island into the sea before you got so far." Another lady, who got into the cars at some distance from Cincinnati, could not understand the value which we set upon ruins. "We should chaw them up," she said, "make roads or bridges of them, unless Barnum transported them to his museum. We would never keep them on our own hook as you do." "You value them yourselves," I answered. "Any one would be lynched who removed a stone of Ticonderoga." It was an unfortunate speech, for she archly replied, "Our only ruins are British fortifications, and we go to see them because they remind us that we whipped the nation which whips all the world." The Americans, however, though they may talk so, would give anything if they could appropriate a Kenilworth Castle, or a Melrose, or a Tintern Abbey, with its covering of ivy, and make it sustain some episode of their history. But, though they can make railways, ivy is beyond them, and the purple heather disdains the soil of the New World. A very amusing ticket was given me on the Mad River line. It bore the command, "Stick this cheque in your blank," the blank being filled up with a little engraving of a hat. Consequently, I saw all the gentlemen with small pink embellishments to the covering of their heads. We passed through a large and very beautiful portion of the State of Ohio, the soil, wherever cultivated, teeming with crops, and elsewhere with a vegetation no less beautiful than luxuriant, a mixture of small weed prairies, and forests of splendid timber. Extensive districts of Ohio are still without inhabitants, yet its energetic people have constructed, within a period of 5 years, half as many miles of railroad as the whole of Great Britain contains. They are a great people; they do go ahead, these Yankees. The newly cleared soil is too rich for wheat for many years; it grows Indian corn for 30 in succession, without any manure. Its present population is under 3 millions, and it is estimated that it would support a population of 10 millions, almost entirely in agricultural pursuits. We were going ahead, and in a few hours arrived at Forest, the junction of the Clyde, Mad River, and Indiana lines. Away with all English ideas which may be conjured up by the word junction, the labyrinth of iron rails, the smart policemen at the points, the handsome station, and elegant refreshment rooms. Here was a dense forest, with merely a clearing round the rails, a small shanty for the man who cuts wood for the engine, and 2 sidings for the trains coming in different directions. There was not even a platform for passengers, who, to the number of 200 or 300, were standing on the clearing, resting against the stumps of trees. And yet for a few minutes every day the bustle of life pervades this lonely spot, for here meet travellers from east, west, and south, the careworn merchant from the Atlantic cities, and the hardy trapper from the western prairies. We here changed cars for those of the Indianapolis line, and nearly at the same time with 3 other trains, plunged into the depths of the forest. "You're from down east, I guess," said a sharp, nasal voice behind me. This was a supposition first made in the Portland cars, when I was at a loss to know what distinguishing and palpable peculiarity marked me as a down-easter. Better informed now, I replied, "I am." "Going west?" "Yes." "Travelling alone?" "No." "Was you raised down east?" "No, in the old country." "In the little old island? Well, you are kind o' glad to leave it, I guess. Are you a widow?" "No." "Are you travelling on business?" "No." "What business do you follow?" "None." "Well, now, what are you travelling for?" "Health and pleasure." "Well, now, I guess you're pretty considerable rich. Coming to settle out west, I suppose?" "No, I'm going back at the end of the fall." "Well, now, if that's not a pretty tough hickory nut, I guess you Britishers are the queerest critters as ever was raised." I considered myself quite fortunate to have fallen in with such a querist, for the Americans are usually too much taken up with their own business to trouble themselves about yours, beyond such questions as, "Are you bound west, stranger?" or, "You're from down east, I guess." "Why do you take me for a down-easter?" I asked once. "Because you speak like one," was the reply, the frequent supposition that I was a New Englander being nearly as bad as being told that I had not the English accent at all. I was glad to be taken for an American, as it gave me a better opportunity of seeing things as they really are. An English person going about staring and questioning, with a note-book in his hand, is considered fair game, and consequently is crammed on all subjects, stories of petticoated table-legs and fabulous horrors of the bowie-knife being among the smallest of the absurdities swallowed. Our party consisted of 5 persons besides myself. 2 elderly gentlemen, the niece of one of them, and a young married couple. They knew the governor of Indiana, and a candidate for the proud position of senator, also our fellow travellers, and the conversation assumed a political character. In fact, they held a long parliament, for I think the discussion lasted for 3 hours. Extraordinary, and to me unintelligible names, were bandied backwards and forwards. I heard of silver greys, but my companions were not discussing a breed of fowls, and of hard shells and soft shells, but the merits of eggs were not the topic. Whigs and Democrats seemed to be analogous to our Radicals, and Know-Nothings to be a respectable and constitutional party. Whatever minor differences my companions had, they all seemed agreed in hating the Nebraska men, the advocates of an extension of slavery, who one would have thought, from the epithets applied to them, were a set of thieves and cutthroats. A gentleman whose whole life had been spent in opposition to the principles which they are bringing forward was very violent, and the pretty young lady, Mrs. Wood, equally so. After stopping for 2 hours at a wayside shed, we set out again at dark for Lafayette, which we reached at 9. These western cars are crammed to overflowing, and having to cross a wide stream in a ferry boat, the crush was so terrible that I was nearly knocked down. But as American gentlemen freely use their canes where a lady is in the case, I fared better than some of my fellow passengers, who had their coat tails torn and their toes barbarously crushed in the crowd. The steam ferry boat had no parapet, and the weakest were pushed to the side. The centre was filled up with baggage, carts, and horses, and vessels were moored along the river, with the warps crossing each other, to which we had to bow continually to avoid decapitation. When we reached the wharf, quantities of people were waiting to go to the other side, and directly the gangway board was laid, there was a simultaneous rush of 2 opposing currents, and, the insecure board slipping, they were all precipitated into the water. Fortunately it was not deep, so they merely underwent its cooling influences, which they bore with admirable equanimity, only one making a bitter complaint, that he had spoiled his go-to-meetins. The farther west we went, the more dangerous the neighbourhood became. At all the American stations there are placards warning people to beware of pickpockets, but from Indiana westward they bore the caution, "Beware of pickpockets, swindlers, and luggage thieves." At many of the depots there is a general rush for the last car, for the same reason that there is a scramble for the stern cabins in a steamer, viz., the explosive qualities of the boilers. We travelled the whole of that night, our fellow passengers becoming more extravagant in appearance at every station, and morning found us on the prairies. Cooper influences our youthful imaginations by telling us of the prairies. Mayne Reid makes us long to cross them. Botanists tell us of their flowers, sportsmen of their buffaloes, but without seeing them few people can form a correct idea of what they are really like. The sun rose over a monotonous plain covered with grass, rank, high, and silly-looking, blown before the breeze into long shiny waves. The sky was blue above, and the grass a brownish-green beneath. Wild pigeons and turkeys flew over our heads. The horizontal line had not a single inequality. All was hot, unsuggestive, silent, and monotonous. This was the grass prairie. A belt of low timber would bound the expanse, and on the other side of it a green sea would open before us, stretching as far as the eye could reach. Stationary billows of earth, covered with short green grass, which, waving beneath the wind, completed the oceanic illusion. This was the rolling prairie. Again a belt of timber, and a flat surface covered with flowers, brilliant even at this season of the year, though of the most gorgeous, nothing remained but the withered stalks. The ground was enamelled with lilies, the helianthus and cineraria flourished, and the deep green leaves and blue blossom of the lupin contrasted with the prickly stem and scarlet flower of the euphorbia. For what purpose was the wilderness made so gay, where for years no eye sees it, but to show forth his goodness who does what he will with his own? This was the weed prairie, more fitly termed the garden of God. These 3 kinds of prairie were continually alternating with belts of timber and small lakes, but few signs of population were apparent during that long day's journey. We occasionally stopped for water at shanties on the prairies, and took in 2 or 3 men, but this vast expanse of fertile soil must remain for many years a field for the enterprise of the European races. Towards evening we changed cars again, and took in stores of refreshment for our night's journey, as little could be procured along the route. What strange people now crammed the cars! Traders, merchants, hunters, diggers, trappers, and adventurers from every land, most of them armed to the teeth, and not without good reason, for within the last few months, Indians, enraged at the aggression of the white men, have taken a terrible revenge upon western travellers. Some of their rifles were of most costly workmanship, and were nursed with parental care by their possessors. On the seat in front of me were two prairie men, such as are described in the Scalp Hunters, though of an inferior grade to St. Vrain. Fine specimens of men they were, tall, handsome, broad-chested, and athletic, with aquiline noses, piercing grey eyes, and brown curling hair and beards. They wore leathern jackets, slashed and embroidered, leather small clothes, large boots with embroidered tops, silver spurs, and caps of scarlet cloth, worked with somewhat tarnished gold thread, doubtless the gifts of some fair ones enamoured of the handsome physiognomies and reckless bearing of the hunters. Dullness fled from their presence; they could tell stories, whistle melodies, and sing comic songs without weariness or cessation. Fortunate were those near enough to be enlivened by their drolleries during the tedium of a night detention. Each of them wore a leathern belt, with 2 pistols stuck into it, gold earrings, and costly rings. Blithe, cheerful souls they were, telling racy stories of western life, chivalrous in their manners, and free as the winds. There were Californians dressed for the diggings, with leather pouches for the gold dust; Mormons on their way to Utah; and restless spirits seeking for that excitement and variety which they had sought for in vain in civilized life. And conveying this motley assortment of human beings, the cars dashed along, none of their inmates heeding each other, or perhaps Him who heeds and holds them all in His large love and boundless thought. At 11 we came to an abrupt pause upon the prairie. After waiting quietly for some time without seeing any vestiges of a station, my friends got out to inquire the cause of the detention, when we found that a freight train had broken down in front, and that we might be detenus for some time, a mark for Indian bullets! Refreshments were produced and clubbed together, the prairie men told stories, the hunters looked to their rifles, and polished their already resplendent chasing; some Mexicans sang Spanish songs, a New Englander Yankee Doodle; some guessed, others calculated, till at last all grew sleepy; the trappers exhausted their stories, the singers their songs, and a Mormon, who had been setting forth the peculiar advantages of his creed, the patience of his auditors, till at length sonorous sounds, emitted by numerous nasal organs, proving infectious, I fell asleep to dream confusedly of Yankee Doodle, pistols, and pickpockets. In due time I awoke; we were stopping still, and there was a light on our right. "We're at Rock Island, I suppose?" I asked sleepily. A laugh from my friends and the hunters followed the question, after which they informed me in the most polite tones that we were where we had been for the last 5 hours, namely, stationary on the prairie. The intense cold and heavy dew which accompany an American dawn made me yet more amazed at the characteristic patience with which the Americans submit to an unavoidable necessity, however disagreeable. It is true that there were complaints of cold, and heavy sighs, but no blame was imputed to any one, and the quiescence of my companions made me quite ashamed of my English impatience. In England we should have had a perfect chorus of complaints, varied by rowing the conductor, abuse of the company, and resolutions to write to the Times, or bring up the subject of railway mismanagement in the House of Commons. These people sat quietly, ate, slept, and smoked, and were thankful when the cars at last moved off to their destination. On we flew to the west, the land of wild Indians and buffaloes, on the narrow rims of metal with which this great people is girding the earth. Evening succeeded noon, and twilight to the blaze of a summer day. The yellow sun sank cloudless behind the waves of the rolling prairie, yet still we hurried on, only stopping our headlong course to take in wood and water at some nameless stations. When the sun set, it set behind the prairie waves. I was oblivious of any changes during the night, and at rosy dawn an ocean of long green grass encircled us around. Still on, belts of timber diversify the prospect. We rush into a thick wood, and emerging from it arrive at Rock Island, an unfinished-looking settlement, which might bear the name of the Desert City, situated at the confluence of the Rock River and the Mississippi. We stop at a little wharf, where waits a little steamer of uncouth construction; we step in, a steam whistle breaks the silence of that dewy dawn, and at a very rapid rate we run between high wooded bluffs, down a turbid stream, whirling in rapid eddies. We steam for 3 miles, and land at a clearing containing the small settlement of Davenport. We had come down the Mississippi, mightiest of rivers, half a mile wide, 1,700 miles from its mouth, and were in the far west. Waggons with white tilts, thick-hided oxen with heavy yokes, mettlesome steeds with high peaked saddles, picketed to stumps of trees, lashing away the flies with their tails, emigrants on blue boxes, wondering if this were the El Dorado of their dreams, arms, accoutrements, and baggage surrounded the house or shed where we were to breakfast. Most of our companions were bound for Nebraska, Oregon, and Utah, the most distant districts of which they would scarcely reach with their slow-paced animals for 4 months, exposed in the meantime to the attacks of the Sioux, Comanches, and Blackfeet. There, in a long wooden shed with blackened rafters and an earthen floor, we breakfasted, at 7 o'clock, on johnny cake, squirrels, buffalo hump, dampers, and buckwheat, tea and corn spirit, with a crowd of emigrants, hunters, and adventurers, and soon after re-embarked for Rock Island, our little steamer with difficulty stemming the mighty tide of the Father of Rivers. The machinery, such as it was very visible, the boiler patched in several places, and steam escaping in different directions. I asked the captain if he were not in the habit of sitting upon the safety valve, but he stoutly denied the charge. The vernacular of this neighbourhood was rather startling to an English ear. "Who's the alligator to hum?" asked a broad-shouldered Kentuckian of his neighbour, pointing to a frame shanty on the shore, which did not look to me like the abode of that amphibious and carnivorous creature. "Well, old alligator, what's the time o' day?" asked another man, bringing down a brawny paw, with a resounding thump, upon the Herculean shoulders of the first querist, thereby giving me the information that in the West alligator is a designation of the genus homo, in fact, that it is customary for a man to address his fellow-man as old alligator, instead of old fellow. At 8 we left Rock Island, and turning my unwilling steps eastward from the land of adventure and romance, we entered the cars for Chicago. They were extremely crowded, and my friends, securing me the only comfortable seat in one of them, were obliged to go into the next, much to their indignation, but protestations were of no use. The engine bell rang, a fearful rush followed, which resulted in the passage down the centre being filled with standing men. The conductor shouted, "Go ahead," and we were off for Lake Michigan in the Lightning Express, warranted to go 67 miles an hour. I had found it necessary to study physiognomy since leaving England, and was horrified by the appearance of my next neighbour. His forehead was low, his deep-set and restless eyes significant of cunning, and I at once set him down as a swindler or pickpocket. My convictions of the truth of my inferences were so strong, that I removed my purse, in which, however, acting by advice, I never carried more than $5, from my pocket, leaving in it only my handkerchief and the checks for my baggage, knowing that I could not possibly keep awake the whole morning. In spite of my endeavours to the contrary, I soon sank into an oblivious state, from which I awoke to the consciousness that my companion was withdrawing his hand from my pocket. My first impulse was to make an exclamation; my second, which I carried into execution, to ascertain my loss, which I found to be the very alarming one of my baggage checks, my whole property being thereby placed at this vagabond's disposal, for I knew perfectly well that if I claimed my trunks without my checks, the acute baggage-master would have set me down as a bold swindler. The keen-eyed conductor was not in the car, and had he been there, the necessity for habitual suspicion, incidental to his position, would so far have removed his original sentiments of generosity as to make him turn a deaf ear to my request, and there was not one of my fellow-travellers whose physiognomy would have warranted me in appealing to him. So, recollecting that my checks were marked Chicago, and seeing that the thief's ticket bore the same name, I resolved to wait the chapter of accidents, or the reappearance of my friends. I was scarcely able to decide whether this proof of the reliance to be placed on physiognomy was not an adequate compensation for the annoyance I was experiencing, at the probability of my hoarded treasures falling into the hands of an adventurer. During the morning we crossed some prairie country, and stopped at several stations, patches of successful cultivation showing that there must be cultivators, though I rarely saw their habitations. The cars still continued so full that my friends could not join me, and I began to be seriously anxious about the fate of my luggage. At midday, spires and trees, and lofty blocks of buildings, rising from a prairie grass on one side and from the blue waters of Lake Michigan on the other, showed that we were approaching Chicago. Along with beaten tracks through the grass, wagons with white tilts drawn by oxen were proceeding west, sometimes accompanied by armed horsemen. With a whoop like an Indian war whoop the cars ran into a shed. They stopped. The pickpocket got up. I got up too. The baggage-master came to the door. "This gentleman has the checks for my baggage," said I, pointing to the thief. Bewildered, he took them from his waistcoat pocket, gave them to the baggage-master, and went hastily away. I had no inclination to cry, "Stop thief!" and barely had time to congratulate myself on the fortunate impulse which had led me to say what I did, when my friends appeared from the next car. They were too highly amused with my recital to sympathise at all with my feelings of annoyance, and one of them, a gentleman filling a high situation in the East, laughed heartily, saying in a thoroughly American tone, "The English ladies must be cute customers if they can outwit Yankee pickpockets." Meaning to stay all night in Chicago, we drove to the two best hotels, but finding them full, were induced to betake ourselves to an advertising house, the name of which it is unnecessary to give, though it will never be effaced from my memory. The charge advertised was $1 a day, and for this every comfort and advantage were promised. The inn was a large brick building at the corner of a street, with nothing very unprepossessing in its external appearance. The wooden stairs were dirty enough, and on ascending them to the so-called ladies' parlour, I found a large, meanly furnished apartment, garnished with 6 spittoons, which, however, to my disgust, did not prevent the floor from receiving a large quantity of tobacco juice. There were 2 rifles, a pistol, and a powder-flask on the table. 2 Irish emigrant women were seated on the floor, which swarmed with black beetles and ants, undressing a screaming child. A woman evidently in a fever was tossing restlessly on the sofa. 2 females in tarnished bloomer habiliments were looking out of the window, and other extraordinary-looking human beings filled the room. I asked for accommodation for the night, hoping that I should find a room where I could sit quietly. A dirty chambermaid took me to a room or dormitory containing 4 beds. In one part of it 3 women were affectionately and assiduously nursing a sick child. In another 2 were combing tangled black hair, upon which I decided that I must have a room to myself. The chambermaid then took me down a long, darkish passage, and showed me a small room without a fireplace, and only lighted by a pane of glass in the door; consequently it was nearly dark. There was a small bed with dirty buffalo skin upon it. I took it up, and swarms of living creatures fell out of it, and the floor was literally alive with them. The sight of such a room made me feel quite ill, and it was with the greatest reluctance that I deposited my bonnet and shawl in it. Outside the door were some medicine bottles, and other suspicious signs of illness, and after making some cautious inquiries, we found that there was a case of typhus fever in the house, also one of Asiatic cholera, and 3 of ague. My friends were extremely shocked with the aspect of affairs. I believe that they were annoyed that I should see such a specimen of an hotel in their country, and they decided that, as I could not possibly remain there for the night, I should go on to Detroit alone, as they were detained at Chicago on business. Though I certainly felt rather out of my element in this place, I was not at all sorry for the opportunity, thus accidentally given me, of seeing something of American society in its lowest grade. We went down to dinner, and only the fact of not having tasted food for many hours could have made me touch it in such a room. We were in a long apartment, with 1 table down the middle, with plates laid for 100 people. Every seat was occupied, these seats being benches of somewhat uncouth workmanship. The floor had recently been washed, and emitted a damp, fetid odour. At one side was a large fireplace, where, in spite of the heat of the day, sundry manipulations were going on, coming under the general name of cookery. At the end of the room was a long leaden trough or sink, where 3 greasy scullery boys without shoes were perpetually engaged in washing plates, which they wiped upon their aprons. The plates, however, were not washed, only superficially rinsed. There were 4 brigand-looking waiters with prodigious beards and mustachios. There was no great variety at table. There were 8 boiled legs of mutton, nearly raw, 6 antiquated fowls, whose legs were of the consistence of guitar strings, baked pork with onion fixings, the meat swimming in grease, and for vegetables, yams, corn cobs, and squash. A cup of stewed tea, sweetened with molasses, stood by each plate, and no fermented liquor of any description was consumed by the company. There were no carving knives, so each person hacked the joints with his own, and some of those present carved them dexterously with bowie knives taken out of their belts. Neither were there salt spoons, so everybody dipped his greasy knife into the little pewter pot containing salt. Dinner began, and after satisfying my own hunger with the least objectionable dish, namely pork with onion fixings, I had leisure to look round me. Every quarter of the globe had contributed to swell that motley array, even China. Motives of interest or adventure had drawn them all together to this extraordinary outpost of civilization, and soon would disperse them among lands where civilization is unknown. As far as I could judge, we were the only representatives of England. There were Scots, for Scots are always to be found where there is any hope of honest gain. There were Irish immigrants, speaking with a rich brogue, French traders from St. Louis, Mexicans from Santa Fe, Californians fitting out, and Californians coming home with fortunes made, keen-eyed speculators from New England, packmen from Canada, prairie men, trappers, hunters, and adventurers of all descriptions. Many of these wore bowie knives or pistols in their belts. The costumes were very varied and picturesque. Two bloomers in very poor green habiliments sat opposite to me, and did not appear to attract any attention, though bloomerism is happily defunct in the States. There had been 3 duels at Chicago in the morning, and one of the duellists, a swarthy, dark-browed villain, sat next but one to me. The quarrel originated in a gambling house, and this Mexican's opponent was mortally wounded, and there he sat, with the guilt of human blood upon his hands, describing to his vis-à-vis the way in which he had taken aim at his adversary, and no one seemed to think anything about it. From what I heard, I fear duelling must have become very common in the West, and no wonder, from the number of lawless spirits who congregate where they can be comparatively unfettered. The second course consisted exclusively of pumpkin pies, but when the waiters changed the plates, their way of cleaning the knives and forks was so peculiarly disgusting that I did not attempt to eat anything. But I must remark that in this motley assemblage there was nothing of coarseness, not a word of bad language, indeed, nothing which could offend the most fastidious ears. I must, in this respect, bear very favourable testimony to the Americans, for in the course of my somewhat extensive travels in the United States, and mixing as I did very frequently with the lower classes, I never heard any of that language which so frequently offends the ear in England. I must not be misunderstood here. Profane language is only too notoriously common in the States, but custom, which in America is frequently stronger than law, totally prohibits its use before ladies. I suppose that there is no country in the world where the presence of a lady is such a restraint upon manners and conversation. A female, whatever her age or rank may be, is invariably treated with deferential respect, and if this deference may occasionally trespass upon the limits of absurdity, or if the extinct chivalry of the past ages of Europe meets with a partial revival upon the shores of America, this extreme is vastly preferable to the brusquerie, if not incivility, which ladies, as I have heard, too often meet with in England. The apparent temperate habits in the United States form another very pleasing feature to dwell upon. It is to be feared that there is a considerable amount of drunkenness among the English, Irish, and Germans, who form a large portion of the American population, but the temperate, tea-drinking, water-drinking habits of the native Americans are most remarkable. In fact, I only saw one intoxicated person in the States, and he was a Scotch fiddler. At the hotels, even when sitting down to dinner in a room with 400 persons, I never on occasion saw more than 2 bottles of wine on the table, and I know from experience that in many private dwelling-houses there is no fermented liquor at all. In the West, more especially at the rude hotels where I stopped, I never saw wine, beer, or spirits upon the table, and the spectacle gratified me exceedingly, of seeing fierce-looking, armed, and bearded men drinking frequently in the day of that cup which cheers but not inebriates. Water is a beverage which I never enjoyed in purity and perfection before I visited America. It is provided in abundance in the cars, the hotels, the waiting-rooms, the steamers, and even the stores, in crystal jugs or stone filters, and it is always iced. This may be either the result or the cause of the temperance of the people. Ancient history tells us of a people who used to intoxicate their slaves, and, while they were in that condition, display them to their sons, to disgust them early with the degrading vice of drunkenness. The emigrants who have left our shores, more particularly the Irish, have voluntarily enacted the part formerly assigned to the slaves of the Spartans. Certain it is that their intemperance, with the evils of which the Americans are only too well acquainted, has produced a beneficial result, causing a strong reaction in favour of temperance principles. The national oath of the English, which has earned for them a horrible sobriquet, and the execrations which belong to the French, Italian, and Spanish nations, are unfortunately but too well known, because they are too often heard. Indeed, I have scarcely ever travelled in England by coach or railway. I have seldom driven through a crowded street, or ridden on horseback through quiet agricultural villages, without hearing language in direct defiance of the third commandment. Profanity and drunkenness are among the crying sins of the English lower orders. Much has been said upon the subject of swearing in the United States. I can only say that, travelling in them as I have travelled in England, and mixing with people of a much lower class than I ever was thrown among in England, mixing with these people, too, on terms of perfect equality, I never heard an oath till after I crossed the Canadian frontier. With regard to both these things, of course I only speak of what fell under my own observation. After dinner, being only too glad to escape from a house where pestilence was rife, we went out into Chicago. It is a wonderful place, and tells more forcibly of the astonishing energy and progress of the Americans than anything I saw. 40 years ago the whole ground on which the town stands could have been bought for $600. Now a person would give $10,000 for the site of a single store. It is built on a level prairie, only slightly elevated above the lake surface. It lies on both sides of the Chicago River, about a mile above its entrance into Lake Michigan. By the construction of piers, a large artificial harbour has been made at the mouth of this river. The city has sprung up rapidly, and is supplied with all the accessories of a high state of civilization. Chicago, in everything that contributes to real use and comfort, will compare favourably with any city in the world. In 1830 it was a mere trading post, situated in the theatre of the Black Hawk War. In 1850 its population was only 28,000 people. It has now not less than 60,000. It had not a mile of railway in 1850. Now 14 lines radiate from it, bringing to it the trade of an area of country equalling 150,000 square miles. 100 heavy trains arrive and depart from it daily. It has a commerce commensurate with its magnitude. It employs about 70,000 tons of shipping, nearly one half being steamers and propellers. The lumber trade, which is chiefly carried on with buffalo, is becoming very profitable. The exports of Chicago to the East, of breadstuffs for the past year, exceeded 13,000,000 bushels, and a city which, in 1840, numbered only 4,000 inhabitants, is now one of the largest exporting grain markets in the world. Chicago is connected with the western rivers by a sloop canal, one of the most magnificent works ever undertaken. It is also connected with the Mississippi at several points by railroad. It is regularly laid out with wide, airy streets, much more cleanly than those of Cincinnati. The wooden houses are fast giving place to lofty, substantial structures of brick, or a stone similar in appearance to a white marble, and are often 6 stories high. These houses, as in all business streets in the American cities, are disfigured up to the 3rd story by large glaring signboards containing the names and occupations of their residents. The sidewalks are of wood, and wherever they are made of this insubstantial material, one frequently finds oneself stepping into a hole, or upon the end of a board which tilts up under one's feet. The houses are always let in flats, so that there are generally 3 stores one above another. These stores are very handsome, those of the outfitters particularly so, though the quantity of goods displayed in the streets gives them rather a barbaric appearance. The sidewalks are literally encumbered with bales of scarlet flannel, and every other article of an emigrant's outfit. At the outfitters' stores you can buy anything, from a cart nail to a revolver, from a suit of oilskin to a paper of needles. The streets present an extraordinary spectacle. Everything reminds that one is standing on the very verge of western civilization. The roads are crowded to an inconvenient extent with carriages of curious construction, wagons, carts, and men on horseback, and the sidewalks with eager foot-passengers. By the side of a carriage drawn by 2 or 3 handsome horses, a creaking wagon with a white tilt, drawn by 4 heavy oxen, may be seen. Mexicans and hunters dash down the crowded streets at full gallop on mettlesome steeds, with bits so powerful as to throw their horses on their haunches when they meet with any obstacle. They ride animals that look too proud to touch the earth, on high-peaked saddles, with pistols in the holsters, short stirrups, and long, cruel-looking Spanish spurs. They wear scarlet caps or palmetto hats, and high jack-boots. Knives are stuck into their belts, and light rifles are slung behind them. These picturesque beings, the bullock wagons setting out for the far west, the medley of different nations and costumes in the streets, make the city a spectacle of great interest. The deep, hollow roar of the locomotive, and the shrill scream from the steamboat, are heard all day. A continuous stream of life ever bustles through the city, and standing as it does on the very verge of western civilization, Chicago is a vast emporium of the trade of the districts east and west of the Mississippi. At an office in one of the streets, Mr. C. took my ticket for Toronto by railway, steamer, only paying $8.50, or about 34 shillings, for a journey of 700 miles. We returned to tea at the hotel, and found our viands and companions just the same as at dinner. It is impossible to give an idea of the Western men to any one who has not seen one at least as a specimen. They are the men before whom the Indians melt away as grass before the scythe. They shoot them down on the smallest provocation, and speak of head of Indian as we do in England of head of game. Their bearing is bold, reckless, and independent in the extreme. They are as ready to fight a foe as to wait upon women and children with tender assiduity. Their very appearance says to you, "Stranger, I belong to the greatest, most enlightened, and most progressive nation on earth. I may be the president or a millionaire next year. I don't care a straw for you or any one else." Illinois is a state which has sprung up, as if by magic, to be one of the most fruitful in the West. It was settled by men from the New England states, men who carried with them those characteristics which have made the New Englander's career one of active enterprise and successful progress wherever he has been. Not many years ago the name of Illinois was nearly unknown, and on her soil the hardy settler battled with the forest trees for space in which to sow his first crops. Her roads were merely rude and often impassable tracks through forest or prairie. Now she has in operation and course of construction 2,070 miles of those iron sinews of commercial progress, railroads, running like a network over the state. At 7 o'clock, with a feeling of great relief, mingled with thankfulness at having escaped untouched by the terrible pestilence which had ravaged Chicago, I left the hotel, more appropriately termed a caravanserai, and my friends placed me in the Lightning Express, warranted to go 67 miles an hour. Unless it may be St. Louis, I fancy that Chicago is more worth a visit than any other of the Western cities. Even one day at it was worth a voyage across the Atlantic, and a land journey of 1,800 miles. End of Chapter 8. Read by Sibella Denton. For more information, please visit LibriVox.org. The Englishwoman in America by Isabella Bird. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 9. The night cars are always crowded, both in Canada and the States, because people in business are anxious to save a day if they have any expedition to make, and as many of the cars are fitted up with seats of a most comfortable kind for night travelling, a person accustomed to them can sleep in them as well as on a sofa. After leaving Chicago, they seemed about to rush with a whoop into the moonlit waters of Lake Michigan, and in reality it was not much better. For 4 miles we ran along a plank road supported only on piles. There was a single track, and carriages projecting over the whole. There was no bridge to be seen, and we really seemed to be going along on the water. These insecure railways are not uncommon in the States. The dangers of the one on the Hudson River have been experienced by many travellers to their cost. We ran 300 miles through central Michigan in 10 hours, including stoppages. We dashed through woods, across prairies, and over bridges without parapets, at a uniform rate of progress. A boy making continual peregrinations with iced water alleviated the thirst of the passengers, for the night was intensely hot, and I managed to sleep very comfortably till awoke by the intense cold of dawn. During the evening an incident most vexatious to me occurred. The cars were very full, and were not able to seat all the passengers. Consequently, according to the usages of American etiquette, the gentlemen vacated the seats in favour of the ladies, who took possession of them in a very ungracious manner, as I thought. The gentlemen stood in the passage down the centre. At last all but one had given up their seats, and while stopping at a station another lady entered. "A seat for a lady," said the conductor, when he saw the crowded state of the car. The one gentleman did not stir. "A seat for a lady," repeated the man in a more imperious tone. Still no movement on the part of the gentleman appealed to. "A seat for a lady! Don't you see there's a lady wanting one?" now vociferated several voices at once, but without producing any effect. "Get up for the lady," said one bolder than the rest, giving the stranger a sharp admonition on the shoulder. He pulled his travelling cap over his eyes, and doggedly refused to stir. There was now a regular hubbub in the car, American blood was up, and several gentlemen tried to induce the offender to move. "I'm an Englishman, and I tell you I won't be browbeat by you beastly Yankees. I've paid for my seat, and I mean to keep it," savagely shouted the offender, thus verifying my worst suspicions. "I thought so. I knew it. A regular John Bull trick. Just like them," were some of the observations made, and very mild they were, considering the aggravated circumstances. Two men took the culprit by his shoulders, and the others, pressing behind, impelled him to the door, amid a chorus of groans and hisses, disposing of him finally by placing him in the emigrant car, installing the lady in the vacated seat. I could almost fancy that the shade of the departed Judge Lynch stood by with an approving smile. I was so thoroughly ashamed of my countrymen, and so afraid of my nationality being discovered, that if any one spoke to me, I adopted every Americanism which I could think of in reply. The country within 50 miles of Detroit is a pretty alternation of prairie, wood, and cornfields, peach and apple orchards. The maize is the staple of the country; you see it in the fields; you have corn cobs for breakfast, corn cobs, mush, and hominy for dinner, Johnny cake for tea, and the very bread contains a third part of Indian meal. I thought the little I saw of Michigan very fertile and pretty. It is another of the newly constituted states, and was known until recently under the name of the Michigan Territory. This state is a peninsula between the Huron and Michigan lakes, and borders in one part closely on Canada. It has a salubrious climate and a fertile soil, and is rapidly becoming a very productive state. Of late years the influx of immigrants of a better class has been very great. The state has had great capabilities for saw and flour mills. The Grand Rapids alone have a fall of 15 feet a mile, and afford immense water power. In Michigan human beings have ceased to be alligators; they are hosses. Thus one man says to another, "How d'ye do, old hoss?" or "What's the time o' day, old hoss?" When I reached Detroit I was amused when a conductor said to me, "One of them 'ere hosses will take your trunks," pointing as he spoke to a group of porters. On arriving at Detroit I met for the first time with tokens of British enterprise and energy, and of the growing importance of Canada West. Several persons in the cars were going to New York, and they took the ferry at Detroit, and went down to Niagara Bridge by the Canada Great Western Railway, as the most expeditious route. I drove through the very pleasant streets of Detroit to the National Hotel, where I was to join the Walrences. Having indulged the hope of rejoining my former travelling companions here, I was greatly disappointed at finding a note from them, containing the intelligence that they had been summoned by telegraph to Toronto to a sick relative. They requested me to join them there, and hoped I should find no difficulty on the journey. It was the time of the State Fair, and every room in the inn was occupied; but Mr. Benjamin, the very popular host of the National, on hearing my circumstances, would on no account suffer me to seek another abode, and requested a gentleman to give up his room to me, which with true American politeness he instantly did. I cannot speak too highly of the National Hotel, or of its deservedly popular landlord. I found that I could not leave Detroit before the next night, and at most hotels a lady alone would have been very uncomfortably placed. Breakfast was over, but as soon as I retired to my room, the waiter appeared with an abundant repast, for which no additional charge was made. I sat in my room the whole day, and Mr. Benjamin came twice to my door to know if I wanted anything. He introduced me to a widow lady, whose room I afterwards shared, and when I went down at night to the steamer he sent one of his clerks with me, to save me any trouble about my luggage. He also gave me a note to an hotel keeper at Buffalo, requesting him to pay me every attention, in case I should be detained for a night on the road. The hotel was the perfect pattern of cleanliness, elegance, and comfort, and the waiters, about 50 of whom were Dutch, attended scrupulously to every wish, actual or supposed, of the guests. If these pages should ever meet Mr. Benjamin's eye, it may be a slight gratification to him to know that his kindness to a stranger has been both remembered and appreciated. I had some letters of introduction to residents at Detroit, and here, as in all other places which I visited, I had but to sow them to reap a rich harvest of kindness and hospitality. I spent 2 days most agreeably at Detroit, in a very refined and intellectual circle, perfectly free from those mannerisms which I had expected to find in a place so distant from the coast. The concurrent testimony of many impartial persons goes to prove that in every American town highly polished and intellectual society is to be met with. My bedroom window at the National Hotel looked into one of the widest and most bustling streets of Detroit. It was the day of the State Fair; consequently, I saw the town under a very favourable aspect. The contents of several special trains, and hundreds of waggons, crowded the streets, the waggons frequently drawn by very handsome horses. The private carriages were of a superior class to any I had previously seen in the States; the harness was handsome and richly plated, and elegantly dressed ladies filled the interiors. But, in amusing contrast, the coachmen all looked like wild Irishmen enlisted for the occasion, and drove in a standing posture. Young farmers, many of them dressed in the extreme of the fashion of young America, were dashing about in their light waggons, driving tandem or span; heavily laden drays were proceeding at a slower speed, and all this traffic was carried on under the shade of fine trees. Military bands playing the Star-Spangled Banner and Hail Columbia were constantly passing and repassing, and the whole population seemed on the qui vive. Squadrons of cavalry continually passed my window, the men in gorgeous uniforms, with high waving plumes. Their horses were very handsome, but were not at all willing to display themselves by walking slowly or in rank, and the riders would seem to have been selected for their corpulence, probably under the supposition that the weight of both men and horse would tell in a charge. The air Hail Columbia is a very fine one, and doubtless thrills American hearts, as ours are thrilled by the national anthem. 2 regiments of foot followed the cavalry, one with peaceful-looking green and white plumes, the other with horse-tails dyed scarlet. The privates had a more independent air than our own regulars, and were principally the sons of respectable citizens. They appeared to have been well drilled, and were superior in appearance to our militia, but it must be remembered that the militia of America constitutes the real military force of the country, and is paid and cared for accordingly, the regular army only amounting to 10,000 men. A gun of the artillery followed, and the spectacle made me laugh immoderately, though I had no one with whom to share my amusement. It was a new-looking gun of shining brass, perfectly innocent of the taste of gunpowder, and mounted on a carriage spuriously like a timber truck, which had once been painted. 6 very respectable-looking artillerymen were clustered upon this vehicle, but they had to hold hard, for it jolted unmercifully. It was drawn by 4 horses of different colours and sizes, and they appeared animated by the principle of mutual repulsion. One of these was ridden by a soldier, seated on a saddle placed so far upon the horse's neck that it gave him the appearance of clinging to the mane. The harness was shabby and travel-soiled, and the traces were of rope, which seemed to require continual fixing, to judge from the frequency with which the rider jumped off to adjust them. The artillerymen were also continually stopping the vehicle, to rearrange the limber of the gun. While I was instituting an invidious comparison between this gun and our well-appointed, well-horsed, well-manned artillery at Woolwich, the thought suddenly flashed across my mind that the militia forces of America beat us at Lexington, Saratoga, and Ticonderoga. A change came o'er the spirit of my dream; from the ridiculous to the sublime was but a step, and the grotesque gun-carriage was instantly invested with sublimity. Various attractions were presented at the fair. There were horse races and trotting matches, a trotting bull warranted to beat the fastest horse in Michigan, and bands of music. Phineas Taylor Barnum presented the spectacle of his very superior menagerie. In one place a wizard offered to show the smallness of the difference between Mem and Tim; the Siamese twins in another displayed their monstrous and inseparable union; and vocalists were awaiting the commands of the lovers of song. There was a large piece of ground devoted to an agricultural exhibition, and here, as at home, Cochin China fowls were the observed of all the observers, and realized fabulous prices. In a long range of booths, devoted to the products of manufacturing industry, some of the costliest productions of the looms of Europe were exhibited for sale. There were peep shows, and swings, and merry-go-rounds, and hobby-horses; and, with so many inducements offered, it will not be supposed that holiday people were wanting. Suddenly, while the diversions were at their height, and in the midst of the intense heat, a deluge burst over Detroit, like the breaking of a waterspout, in a few minutes turning the streets into rivers, deep enough in many places to cover the fetlocks of the horses. It rained as it only rains in a hot climate, and the storm was accompanied by thunder and lightning. Waggons and carriages hurried furiously along; stages intended to carry 12 persons at 6 cents were conveying 20 through the flood at $1 each; and ladies drenched to the skin, with white dresses and silk stockings the colour of mud, were hurried along over the slippery sidewalks. An infantry regiment of militia took to their heels and ran off at full pelt, and a large body of heavy cavalry dashed by in a perfect hurricane of moustaches, draggled plumes, cross-bands, gigantic white gloves, and clattering sabres, clearing the streets effectually. 100 years ago, Detroit was a little French village of wooden houses, a mere post for carrying the fur trade with the Indians. Some of these houses still remain, dingy, many-windowed, many-gabled buildings, of antique construction. Canoes laden with peltry were perhaps the only craft which disturbed the waters of the Detroit River. The old times are changed, and a thriving commercial town of 40,000 inhabitants stands on the site of the French trading post. Handsome quays and extensive wharves now line the shores of the Detroit River, and to look at the throng of magnificent steamers and small sailing vessels lying among them, sometimes 2 or 3 deep, one would suppose oneself at an English seaport. The streets, which contain very handsome stores, are planted with trees, and are alive with business, and hotels, banks, and offices appear in every direction. Altogether, Detroit is a very pleasing place, and from its position bids fair to be a very important one. I had to leave the friends whose acquaintance and kindness rendered Detroit so agreeable to me in the middle of a very interesting conversation. Before 10 at night I found myself on apparently interminable wharf, creeping between cart-wheels and over bales of wool to the Mayflower steamer, which was just leaving for Buffalo. Passing through the hall of the Mayflower, which was rather a confused and dimly lighted scene, I went up to the saloon by a very handsome staircase with elaborate bronze balustrades. My bewildered eyes surveyed a fairy scene, an Eastern palace, a vision of the Arabian Nights. I could not have believed that such magnificence existed in a ship. It impressed me much more than anything I have seen in the palaces of England. The Mayflower was a steamship of 2200's burthen, her length 336 feet, and her extreme breadth 60. She was of 1000 horse-power, with 81-inch cylinders, and a stroke of 12 feet. I speak of her in the past tense, because she has since been totally cast away in a storm on Lake Erie. This lake bears a very bad character, and persons are warned not to venture upon it at so stormy a season of the year as September, but, had the weather been very rough, I should not have regretted my voyage in so splendid a steamer. The saloon was 300 feet long. It had an arched roof and Gothic cornice, with moulding below of gilded grapes and vine leaves. It was 10 feet high, and the projections of the ceiling, the mouldings, and the panels of the doors of the state-rooms were all richly gilded. About the middle there was an enclosure for the engine, scarcely obstructing the view. This enclosure was Gothic, to match the roof, and at each end had a window of plate glass 6 feet square, through which the mechanism of the engine could be seen. The engine itself, being a high-pressure one, and consequently without the encumbrances of condenser and air-pump, occupied much less room than one of ours in a ship of the same tonnage. Every stationary part of the machinery was of polished steel, or bronze, with elaborate castings. A crank indicator and a clock faced each other, and the whole was lighted by 2 large coloured lamps. These windows were a favourite lounge of the curious and scientific. The carpet was of rich velvet pile, in groups of brilliant flowers, and dotted over with chairs, sofas, and tête-à-têtes of carved walnut wood, cushioned with the richest green velvet. The tables were of marble with gilded pedestals. There was a very handsome piano, and both it and the tables supported massive vases of beautiful Sèvres or Dresden china, filled with exotic flowers. On one table was a richly chased silver tray, with a silver ewer of iced water upon it. The saloon was brilliantly lighted by 8 chandeliers with dependent glass lustres, and at each end 2 mirrors, the height of the room, prolonged interminably the magnificent scene. In such an apartment one would naturally expect to see elegantly dressed gentlemen and ladies, but no, Western men in palmetto hats and great boots lounged upon the superb sofas, and negroes and negresses chattered and promenaded. Porcelain spittoons in considerable number garnished the floor, and their office was by no means a sinecure one, even in the saloon exclusively devoted to ladies. I saw only one person whom I liked to speak to among my 300 fellow voyagers. This was a tall, pale, and a very ladylike person in deep mourning, with a perfectly uninterested look, and such deep lines of sorrow on her face, that I saw at a glance that the world had no power to interest or please her. She sat on the same sofa with me, and was helplessly puzzling over the route from Buffalo to Albany with a gruff, uncouth son, who seemed by no means disposed to aid her in her difficulties. As I was able to give her the information she wanted, we entered into conversation for 2 hours. She soon told me her history, merely an ordinary one, of love, bereavement, and sorrow. She had been a widow for a year, and she said that her desolation was so great that her sole wish was to die. Her sons were taking her on a tour, in the hope of raising her spirits, but she said she was just moved about and dressed like a doll, and that she had not one ray of comfort, and that all shrunk from her hopeless and repining grief. She asked me to tell her if any widow of my acquaintance had been able to bear her loss with resignation, and when I told her of some instances among my own relations, she burst into tears, and said, "I am ever arraigning the wisdom of God, and how can I hope for his consolations?" The task of a comforter is ever a hard one, and in her instance it was particularly so, to point to the balm of Gilead, as revealed in sacred Scripture, for a stranger to show her in all kindness that comfort could never be experienced while, as she herself owned, she was living in the neglect of every duty both to God and man. She seemed roused for the moment, and thanked me for the sympathy which I most sincerely felt, hoping at the same time to renew the conversation in the morning. We had a stormy night, from which she suffered so much as to be unable to leave her berth the next day, and I saw nothing further of her beyond a brief glimpse which I caught of her at Buffalo, as she was carried ashore, looking more despairing even than the night before. Below this is the ladies' cabin, also very handsome, but disfigured by numerous spittoons, and beneath this again is a small cabin with berths 2 deep round the sides, and in this abode, as the ship was full, I took a berth for the night with a southern lady, her 2 female slaves, 4 negresses, and a mulatto woman, who had just purchased their freedom in Tennessee. These blacks were really ladylike and intelligent, and so agreeable and naïve that although they chattered to me until 2 in the morning, I was not the least tired of them. They wanted me to bring them all home to England, to which they have been taught to look as a land of liberty and happiness, and it was with much difficulty that I made them understand that I should not be able to find employment for them. I asked one of them, a very fine-looking mulatto, how long she had been married, and her age. She replied that she was 34, and had been married 21 years. Their black faces and woolly hair contrasted most ludicrously with the white pillow-case. After sleeping for a time, I was awoke by a dissonance of sounds, groaning, straining, creaking, and the crash of waves and roar of wind. I dressed with difficulty, and crawling to the window, beheld a cloudless sky, a thin, blue, stormy-looking mist, and waves higher than I had ever seen those on the ocean. Indeed, Lake Erie was one sheet of raging, furious billows, which dashed about our leviathan but top-heavy steamer as if she had been a plaything. I saw 2 schooners scudding with only their foresails set, and shortly after a vessel making signals of distress, having lost her masts, bulwarks, and boats in the gale. We were enabled to render her very seasonable assistance. I was not now surprised at the caution given by the stewardess the previous night, namely, that the less I undressed the better in case of an accident. While the gale lasted, being too much inured to rough weather to feel alarmed, I amused myself with watching the different effects produced by it on the feelings of different persons. The southern lady was frantic with terror. First she requested me, in no very gentle tones, to call the stewardess. I went to the abode of that functionary, and found her lying on the floor sea-sick, her beautiful auburn hair tangled and dishevelled. "Oh, madam, how could you sleep?" she said. "We've had such an awful night. I've never been so ill before." I returned from my useless errand, and the lady then commanded me to go instantly to the captain and ask him to come. "He's attending to the ship," I urged. "Go, then, if you've any pity, and ask him if we shall be lost." "There's no danger, as far as I can judge. The engines work regularly, and the ship obeys her helm." The Mayflower gave a heavier roll than usual. "Oh, my God! Oh, heaven!" shrieked the unhappy lady. "Forgive me! Mercy! Mercy!" A lull followed, in which she called to one of her slaves for a glass of water, but the poor creature was too ill to move; and seeing that her mistress was about to grow angry, I went up to the saloon for it. On my way to the table I nearly tumbled over a prostrate man, whom I had noticed the night before as conspicuous for his audacious and hearty bearing. "I guess we're going to Davy Jones," he said. "I've been sayin' my prayers all night. Little good, I guess. I've been a sinner too long. I've seen many a—" A groan followed. I looked at the reckless speaker. He was lying on the floor, with his hat and shoes off, and his rifle beside him. His face was ghastly, but I verily believe more from the effects of sea-sickness than fear. He begged me, in feeble tones, to get him some brandy, but I could not find anybody to give it to him, and went down with the water. The two slaves were as frightened as people almost stupefied by sickness could be, but when I asked one of the freed negresses if she were alarmed, she said, "Me no fear. If me die, me go to Jesus Christ. If me live, me serve him here. Better to die." It has been said that poverty, sickness, all the ills of life, are paradise to what we fear of death; that it is not that life is sweet, but that death is bitter. Here the poet and the philosopher might have learned a lesson. This poor, untutored negress probably knew nothing more than her Bible true; but she had that knowledge of a future state which reason, unassisted by the light of revelation, could never have learned. She knew God as revealed in Christ, and in that knowledge, under its highest and truest name of faith, she feared not the summons which would call her into the presence of the Judge of all. The infidel may hug his heartless creed, which, by ignoring alike futurity and the divine government, makes an aimless chaos of the past, and a gloomy obscurity of the future; but, in the hour of death and in the day of judgment, the boldest atheist in existence would thankfully exchange his failing theories for the poor African's simple creed. Providence has given the negro an amount of heart and enthusiasm to which we are strangers. He is warm and ardent in his attachments, fierce in his restfulness, terrible in his revenge. The black troops of our West Indian colonies, when let loose, fight with more fury and bloodthirstiness than those of any white race. This temperament is carried into religion, and nowhere on earth does our Lord find a more loving and zealous disciple than in the converted and Christianized negro. It is indeed true, that in America only, more than 3,000,000 free-born Africans wear the chains of servitude; but it is no less true, that in many instances the gospel has penetrated the shades of their Egyptian darkness, giving them a clear escape from tyrannizing lust, a full immunity from penal woe. Many persons who have crossed the Atlantic without annoyance are discomposed by the short chopping surges of these inland seas, and the poor negresses suffered dreadfully from sea-sickness. As the stewardess was upstairs, and too ill herself to attend upon any one, I did what I could for them, getting them pillows, camphor, etc., only too happy that I was in a condition to be useful. One of them, a young married woman with a baby of 3 months old, was alarmingly ill, and as the poor infant was in danger of being seriously injured by the rolling of the ship, I took it on my lap for an hour till the gale moderated, thereby gaining the lasting, kindly remembrance of its poor mother. I am sure that a white infant would have screamed in a most appalling way, for, as I had never taken a baby in my arms before, I held it in a very awkward manner; but the poor little black thing, wearied with its struggles on the floor, lay very passively, every now and then turning its little monkey face up to mine, with a look of understanding and confidence which quite conciliated my good will. It was so awfully ugly, so much like a black ape, and so little like the young of the human species, that I was obliged while I held it to avert my eyes from it, lest in a sudden fit of foolish prejudice and disgust I should let it fall. Meanwhile the southern lady was very ill, but not too ill, I am sorry to say, to box the ears of her slaves. The gale moderated about 9 in the morning, leaving a very rough, foamy sea, which reflected in a peculiarly dazzling and disagreeable way the cloudless and piercing blue of the sky. The saloon looked as magnificent as by candlelight, with the sunshine streaming through a running window of stained glass. Dinner on a plentiful scale was served at 1, but out of 300 passengers only about 30 were able to avail themselves of it. Large glass tubs of vanilla ice cream were served. The voyage was peculiarly uninteresting, as we were out of sight of land nearly the whole day. My friend the widow did not appear, and when I attempted to write, the inkstand rolled off the table. It was just sunset when we reached Buffalo, and moored at a wharf crowded with large steamers receiving and discharging cargo. Owing to the gale, we were 2 hours too late for the Niagara cars, and I slept at the Western Hotel, where I received every attention. Buffalo is one of the best samples of American progress. It is a regularly laid out and substantially built city of 65,000 inhabitants. It is still in the vigour of youth, for the present town only dates from 1813. It stands at the foot of Lake Erie, at the opening of the Hudson Canal, where the commerce of the great chain of inland lakes is condensed. It is very going ahead, its inhabitants are ever changing, its population is composed of all nations, with a very large proportion of Germans, French, and Irish. But their national characteristics, though not lost, are seen through a medium of pure Americanism. They all rush about, the lethargic German keeps pace with the energetic Yankee, and the Irishman, no longer in rags, guesses and speculates in the brogue of Erin. Western travellers pass through Buffalo, tourists bound for Canada pass through Buffalo, the traffic of lakes, canals, and several lines of rail centres at Buffalo, so engines scream and steamers puff all day long. It has a great shipbuilding trade, and to all appearances is one of the most progressive and go-ahead cities in the Union. I left Buffalo on a clear frosty morning, by a line which ran between lumber yards on a prodigious scale and the hard white beach of Lake Erie. Soon after leaving the city, the lake becomes narrow and rapid, and finally hurries along with fearful velocity. I knew I was looking at the commencement of the rapids of Niagara, but the cars ran into some clearings, and presently stopped at a very bustling station, where a very officious man shouted, "Niagara Falls Station." The name grated unpleasantly on my ears. A man appeared at the door of the car in which I was the only passenger. "You for Lewiston! Quick, this way!" and hurried me into a stage of uncouth construction, drawn by 4 horses. We jolted along the very worst road I ever travelled on. Corduroy was Elysium to it. No level was observed; it seemed to be a mere track along waste land, running through holes, over hillocks, and stumps of trees. We were 1 hour and 3/4 in going a short 7 miles. If I had been better acquainted with the neighbourhood, I might, as I only found out when I was too late, have crossed the bridge at Niagara Falls, spent 3 hours inside of Niagara, proceeding to Queenston in time for the steamer by the Canada cars. On our way to Lewiston we met 40 of these 4-horse stages. I caught a distant view of the falls, and a nearer one of the yet incomplete suspension bridge, which when finished will be one of the greatest triumphs of engineering art. Beyond this the scenery is very beautiful. The road runs among forest trees of luxuriant growth, and peach and apple orchards, upon the American bank of the Niagara River. This bank is a cliff 300 feet high, and from the edge of the road you may throw a stone into the boiling torrent below, yet the only parapet is a rotten fence, in many places completely destroyed. When you begin to descend the steep hill to Lewiston, the drive is absolutely frightful. The cumbrous vehicle creaks, jolts, and swings, and, in spite of friction brakes and other appliances, gradually acquires an impetus which sends it at full speed down the tremendous hill, and round the sharp corner, to the hotel at Lewiston. While I was waiting there watching the stages, and buying peaches, of which I got 6 for a penny, a stage came at full speed down the hill, with only 2 men on the driving seat. The back straps had evidently given way, and the whole machine had a tendency to jump forward, when, in coming down the steep part of the declivity, it got a jolt, and in the most ridiculous way turned topsy-turvy, the roof coming down upon the horses' backs. The men were thrown off unhurt, but the poor animals were very much cut and bruised. I crossed Lake Ontario to Toronto in the Peerless, a very smart, safe iron steamer, with the saloon and chief weight below. The fittings of this beautiful little vessel are in perfect taste. We stopped for 2 hours at the wharf at Niagara, a town on the British side, protected once by a now disused and dismantled fort. The cars at length came up, 2 hours after their time, and the excuse given for the delay was, that they had run over a cow. In grim contrast to the dismantled English Fort Massasoit, Fort Niagara stands on the American side, and is a place of considerable strength. There I saw sentinels in grey uniforms, and the flag of the Stars and Stripes. Captain D of the Peerless brought his beautiful little vessel from the Clyde in 6,000 pieces, and is justly proud of her. I sat next to him at dinner, and found that we knew some of the same people in Scotland. Gaelic was a further introduction, and though so many thousand miles away, for a moment I felt myself at home when we spoke of the majestic Cuchulains and the hardy braes of Balquhidder. In the Peerless every one took wine or liquors. There was no bill of fare, but a long list of wines and spirits was placed by each plate. Instead of being disturbed in the middle of dinner by a poke on the shoulder and the demand dinner ticket or 50 cents, I was allowed to remain as long as I pleased, and at the conclusion of the voyage a gentlemanly Highland purser asked me for my passage and dinner money together. We passed a number of brigs and schooners under full sail, their canvas remarkable for its whiteness; their hulls were also snowy white. They looked as though they were drifting with the dead to shores where all was dumb. Late in the evening we entered the harbour of Toronto, which is a very capacious one, and is protected by a natural mole of sand some miles in extent. Though this breakwater has some houses and a few trees, it is the picture of dreary desolation. The city of Toronto, the stronghold of Canadian learning and loyalty, presents an imposing appearance, as seen from the water. It stands on ground sloping upwards from the lake, and manufactories, colleges, asylums, church spires, and public buildings, the whole faced by a handsome line of quays, present themselves at once to the eye. A soft and familiar sound came from off the shore; it was the well-known note of the British bugle, and the flag whose silken folds were rising and falling on the breeze was the meteor flag of England. Long may it brave the battle and the breeze! English uniforms were glancing among the crowd on the quay, English faces surrounded me, English voices rang in my ears, the negligee costumes which met my eyes were in the best style of England. A thrill of pleasure went through my heart on finding, more than 4,000 miles from home, the characteristics of my own loved land. But I must add that there were unpleasant characteristics peculiarly English also. I could never have landed, the confusion was so great, had not Captain D assisted me. One porter ran off with one trunk, another with another, while 3 were fighting for the possession of my valise, till silenced by the cane of a custom-house officer. Then there was a clamorous demand for wharfage, and the hackman charged $half for taking me 1/4 of a mile. All this somewhat damped my ecstasies, and contrasted unfavourably with the orderly and easy way in which I landed on the shore of the United States. At Russell's Hotel I rejoined Mr. and Mrs. Walrence, who said they would have been extremely surprised if a lady in their country had met with the slightest difficulty or annoyance in travelling alone for 700 miles. My ecstasies were still further toned down when I woke the next morning with my neck, hands, and face stinging and swollen from the bites of innumerable mosquitoes. Chapter 9. Read by Sibella Denton. For more information, please visit LibriVox.org.